Day spends most of the first section of her book introducing us to the parents and sisters of Saint Thérèse, which should indicate for us Day's respect for marriage and parenthood and her understanding of the family as a sphere of moral and spiritual formation. For Day, we are always best known in the context of our communities, so to know the Martin family and to know the Carmelite community at Lisieux is to know Thérèse. Particularly following the canonizations of Louis and Zélie Martin in 2015, we might be more familiar with the contours of their lives than were Day's original readers in the 1960s. But it seems to me that in the intimate picture that Day draws for us of life in the Martin family home, we can pick out particular habits and dispositions where Day recognizes signs of holiness and of the little way already at work. Thérèse's father, Louis Martin, came from a military background and moved multiple times in childhood. It is this that Day later credits his lifelong love of travel and pilgrimage, a love that Day herself also shared. Day, a pacifist, writes with respect for this aspect of Louis' formation, in spite of the fact that she herself opposed war and violence in every form. He was a deeply religious man with a sense of awe, responsibility, and duty that infused everything that he did. Biographies of Louis suggest that he had hoped for a military career, but found no great leader, no Napoleon to follow. Day notes that the desire for a leader is in us all, for a leader and a temporal cause to match in its grandeur the glimpses of the absolute that comes to us in rare flashes. In my own experience, this desire fuels many of those who come to spend a season or their life in the Catholic worker movement, and I suspect that Day recognized this instinct for the heroic in herself as well as many of those around her. Louis trained as a watchmaker, which required a long apprenticeship for such meticulous work, and Day is careful in her text to present him as a working man, in spite of the comfortable bourgeois life that he and Zélie would later provide for their daughters. As Day writes, one can sweat quite as much over small things as over big things. A meticulous work like that of watchmaking can be more a strain on the nerves than any heavy manual labor. In 1845, Louis applied for admission to the monastery of Great St. Bernard, which ran a hospice for travelers high up in the Alps, but he was rejected. Accepting this at God's will, Louis worked, devoted himself to the church as a single layman, and went for long walks in the woods or spent free time fishing and brought fish to the poor clerics in a neighboring town. Day does inquire what Louis might have known of the left-wing social movements of his time. She suspects that he may have had more contact with them than his biographers acknowledge, and feels that he would have been sympathetic to those who addressed social ills systemically and not exclusively through charity, although this may reveal more about Day's inclinations than Louis'. Zélie Guérin likewise came from a military family, but endured a difficult childhood with a mother who was stringent, religiously inflexible, and frugal. In a letter to her brother, Isidore, Zélie wrote, quote, "My childhood and youth were shrouded in sadness, for if our mother spoiled you, to me, as you know, she was too severe. Good as she was, she did not know how to treat me, so that I suffered deeply." Both Zélie and her sister, Marie-Louise, desired to enter religious life, but only Marie-Louise was accepted. Of the refusal to admit Zélie to the convent, Day writes, "It seemed to be one of those arbitrary acts which come so often in our lives, which disconcert us, for which we can see no reason. One would think that a young, healthy, pious girl who came from a hard-working family would be received with open arms by a community of teaching nuns. There is always talk of the need for vocations. And yet here she was turned down without rhyme or reason. Such a refusal must have meant a grave humiliation for the young girl. She must have wondered what there was in her that made the Mother Superior refuse her admittance. It shows, however, her complete acceptance of the will of God, her abandonment to divine providence, that she took the refusal with no rebellion, and certainly with no sense of failure." In this passage that Day writes, we see for the first time what will become a major theme in this text: rejection as a means by which God allows us to discover our true vocation. Louis and Zélie desired to enter religious life. The closing of this door led them to a marriage which produced a doctor of the church. In the preface to this book, Day writes movingly, if briefly, on her deep love for both her child and her child's father, Forster Batterham. Although Day separated from her common-law husband when she became Catholic, and Batterham would not agree to regularize their commitment to each other in the eyes of either church or state, letters between the couple in the years that followed reveals Day's anguish over their incompatible convictions. They were deeply in love, but also respected each other's autonomy and moral integrity. Day was devastated by the end of their relationship, but if she and Batterham had married and gone on to have more children, would Day have ever met Peter Morin, launched a newspaper, or founded the Catholic worker movement? Zélie, like Louise, took up a trade, learning the lacework tradition, which Alencon is famous for, which UNESCO recognizes as a treasure of humanity's intangible cultural heritage. Her work brought beauty into the world. She prayed that if God did not want her as a nun like her sister, God would instead let her be married and have children, and let all the children be consecrated back to God. When Louis and Zélie met on a bridge one day, Zélie heard a voice say, "This is the man that you are going to marry." The sense of clarity only results from openness. For God to speak to us in this way, we have to be ready to listen. Zélie's calm acceptance of her denial of admission to the convent made it possible for her to hear the call to marry Louis so quickly. After a 10-month period of celibacy at the beginning of their marriage, during which Zélie and Louis practiced charity through the church, each ran their own businesses and undertook the care of a foster son who had lost his mother, the couple quickly conceived their first child, Marie. 2 more girls, Pauline and Léonie, followed in quick succession. Léonie was frail from infancy, and with her, Day writes, Zélie began to know the anguish of a mother. The Martin family lost the next daughter to a childhood illness and then 2 sons in infancy. Their next daughter, Céline, survived to adulthood, but another baby sister that followed died before her first birthday. Finally, Zélie gave birth to Thérèse, her last child, in January of 1873. Zélie was 41 when Thérèse was born, and Louis was nearly 50. Thérèse was their 9th child, and 4 had already died. Like Day, Zélie thought she would not be able to have any more children, and also like Day, she was delighted by this unexpected pregnancy. Of Thérèse, Zélie wrote that even in the womb, when I am singing, she sings with me. Day devotes an entire chapter to differentiating Marie, Pauline, Léonie, and Céline, all of whom ultimately entered religious life, individuating them all and bringing out their distinct qualities. Holiness, Day is careful to demonstrate, does not belong to one particular type of personality. In another lecture, we'll talk more about the Martin sisters, particularly Léonie, but to close for now, I'd like to turn to Day's discussion of gender and labor in the home. At one point in this section, Day quotes a letter Zélie wrote to her younger brother, advising him on what to look for in a wife. She says, "As you know, all that glitters is not gold. The principal thing is to seek out a real homemaking woman who is not afraid to soil her hands with work and who cares for dress only as much as it must be cared for, who knows how to train her children to labor and piety. Such a woman would frighten you. She would not be brilliant enough in your eyes or in the eyes of the world, but sensible men would love her better with nothing than another with a dowry of 50,000 francs who lacks the qualities I have mentioned." Isidore did end up marrying a wonderful woman, Céline, who Zélie loved, and when Zélie died of cancer at 45, she left her family in the care of Isidore and Céline. Notably, Zélie realized quickly that her husband alone would not be able to adequately care for their daughters, much as he was devoted to them. Day's selection of this quotation reveals something about how she understands womanhood and a particular feminine style of virtue. Later, Day quotes, "I write as a woman, and I do not mean to disparage Mr. Martin, who was, by all accounts, an amazingly attractive and holy man. But I cannot help but see, and it would not be honest if I did not state it, that the position of the mother in this household was one of hard and driving toil, whereas that of the man was a more leisured one of travel, business contacts, in addition to plenty of time for the life of the spirit. He did not lead the life of hard work that his wife, and even later his daughters, led. Day, a single mother, and eventually the head of the often chaotic Catholic worker household in New York City and on various farms, well understood the amount of physical and mental labor it took to educate children and keep a home running relatively peacefully. Her frequent references to the works of mercy that the Martins regularly offered to less wealthy neighbors also reflects an intimate knowledge of caregiving. Gender for Day is often essentialized. In her writing, there are particular habits of thought and ways of knowing that are specific to women and to men. This might strike contemporary readers as odd, but in Day's other writing, we can see how these gendered types were borne out in her experiences with romantic relationships, in the management of Catholic worker houses of hospitality and farming communes, and in wider social movements. In the Martin family, Day recognized a particular feminized form of suffering in unrelenting domestic labor, childbearing, and illness. When these mortifications are endured with acceptance and offered back to God, God allows them to become electrified with grace. Endurance and acceptance are, for Day, the feminine face of fortitude. Although she faced down armed officers on many occasions and would be shot at in Koinonia, Georgia, the courage that Day demonstrated throughout her own life was the courage of perseverance, the courage to keep seeking the will of God through the works of mercy and the works of peace. Unlike many of the holy men and women of the 20th century, such as St. Edith Stein, St. Oscar Romero, or Blessed Franz Jägerstatter and Blessed Isidore Bacanja, Day was not a martyr. She died of heart failure in her 80s. Day had many, many opportunities to see the face of God in her neighbors' suffering and to work to alleviate their pain. Through the lives of St. Thérèse and the members of her family, Day invites us to consider what apparent failures and rejections God might be asking us to accept in service of our true vocation, and where we might practice the little way in our own lives and contexts.